The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
My baby dolls, we are back again. Summer vacation has ended for me. As always, I am your host, Ian Kahanowitz, and you are starting and you're listening to a new season of Genesis. And boy, this is going to be some season. We are going to start it out with a bang, literally. We are going to be talking with Matthew Polly and his new biography on Bruce Lee. And let me tell you something, folks. You don't know Bruce Lee until you read this biography. It is that good. Even before I mention anything else, I want to tell you, go out, get this book. Whatever you've read before, whatever fables or myths that have been floating around for the last 45 years, Mr. Polly dispels it in this wonderfully researched, sometimes a little too well researched. I mean, it took him 7 years to write the book and probably a lifetime studying about Lee. But go out, get the book. We're going to get to Matthew in just a minute. But, of course, you are listening to the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network with the Zigzag Man, Ralph Tycho. Baseball season's coming to an end. Football season just began. Hockey's in preseason. Basketball's revving up. It's the season of sports. Summer's over. And, unfortunately, we've had a few bad hurricanes. We definitely send our thoughts and prayers out to those who have lost their houses and maybe a friend and maybe who are injured. And we pray for them. And this network, this show, myself, we all send our prayers, our hearts, our love, and, of course, we give donations for those affected by Hurricane Florence and, of course, Hurricane Gordon. But now I'm going to be turning to Matthew Polly, and I'm really honored because Matthew, he's just done so many interviews. I think he went to Europe recently, and he's come onto my show. I mean, the guy has credentials. I always thought I was a geek going to school for 32 years and having 3 masters and a law degree. Matthew Polly is the national best-selling author of American, I don't even know if I'm saying it right, but I'll ask him after, Shaolin and Tapped Out. He is a Princeton University graduate and a Rhodes Scholar, just like Bill Clinton. He spent 2 years studying Kung Fu at the Shaolin Temple in Henson, China. We're going to go into that because he did it in the early 90s, right after Tiananmen Square, where China wasn't such a safe place. His writing has appeared in the Washington Post, Esquire, Slate, Playboy. Yeah, people actually read Playboy rather than look at pictures. And The Nation. He is a fellow at Yale University and lives in New Haven, Connecticut, which, of course, is halfway from me back home to New York City because, of course, I moved to Red Sox territory, and I've been here for 25 years. But my home still is in New York City, and New Haven is right at the break between 91 and 95. And if you want to go to Hartford, you go to 91. But Matt's here today, and without any further ado, welcome to the show, Matt.
Ian, thanks so much for having me on.
Oh, it's an honor, really. Let me ask you this, Bruce Lee. You were 12 years old. You grew up in Topeka, Kansas, for God's sake. Your father was a doctor. You were a scrawny kid, like it says in the bios here. You're growing up, and all of a sudden you see Enter the Dragon, your whole life has changed.
It was really literally like that. It was the first VHS tape I'd ever seen. On the first VCR in my hometown of Topeka, Kansas. They brought it down, and they said, you got to watch this, and it was Enter the Dragon. And as soon as I saw Bruce Lee, I was like, I want to be him. I want to be as cool and as badass as Bruce Lee.
And you know something? Now, here's something I did digging. Now, and then you can, give your opinion on this. Bruce Lee was born in the year of the dragon, 1940.
Yep.
Now, he is what is considered a gold dragon. And some of the characteristics of a gold dragon is natural and straightforward, unpredictable, with continually changing emotions. Now, some of their personality traits, and I'm going to read it word for word. Gifted with innate courage, tenacity, and intelligence, dragons are enthusiastic and confident. They are not afraid of challenges and willing to take risks. Now, my final paragraph, and they're going to let you comment to this. However, the dragon is sometimes regarded as aggressive, and angry dragons are not open to criticism. They don't consider themselves irritating and arrogant. Instead of following tradition They strive for a smooth future. These things I just said is the basis for your whole book.
I think that's absolutely right. I found it amazing, too, that Bruce Lee, whose nickname was the Little Dragon as a stage actor in Hong Kong, and that became his whole symbol, is a dragon. I mean, he had fire in the belly. We can get to it, but he overheated at the end. And he was a leader who was willing to take risks, but hated criticism. It's in the stars, brother. It's in the stars.
But, it's funny because when I get into how he had, he always had confrontation, whether it was his boss at the Chinese restaurant or, the director when he was working with Bruce. There was always some sort of confrontation. But his father was a stage actor who traveled, and, of course, Bruce was born in San Francisco. A lot of people don't know that. What was his father doing in America at the time?
At the time, Japan had invaded mainland China, and Hong Kong was basically a refugee camp and also a base of support for the Chinese. And so his father had been invited over to America as part of the opera troupe to give performances, but also to try to raise money from Chinese immigrants in America to take back for the war effort. And it was a year-long tour, mostly based in San Francisco, but his father went to other cities, including New York. And his mother was a little worried his father might not come back. So she went with him and got pregnant. And so Bruce Lee was born in 1940 in San Francisco's Chinatown Hospital. And that's how he got his original Chinese name, Bruce Junfan Lee, which means to shake up or excite San Francisco.
What was exciting about your book, and, I'm one of those historians because I got over 400 books in my house, and I read every word. You really spend a hell of a lot of time on Bruce Lee's childhood, his teenage years, and well up to like the late 1950s, really, when he's going back to America. How do you think, and I'm not going to ask this in a general question because it's too general. You wouldn't be able to answer it all in one show. But let me ask you this. Knowing that his father was an actor, knowing that his father smoked opium, and there was this sense of fight in him because he wasn't the favorite son, how do you think this affected him going forward as he got older?
I think he grew up with a chip on his shoulder. I think he had a touch of Napoleon complex, and he had a kind of swagger like, come, you think you're better than me? Let me show you. And that's because you pointed out three of the most important characteristics that people had missed in past biographies of Bruce Lee, which was his father was an actor, but is also became an opium addict. And so Bruce was angry about that. And also Bruce had an older brother, Peter, who was the favored son, the perfect student, the quiet, thoughtful, studious one. And Bruce was the one who was hyperactive, probably ADHD, always in trouble, and seeking his father's approval and yet never getting it. And so I think he spent his whole life trying to get his father's approval by becoming an even bigger star than his father was. And that's where and I think that's where the issue with authority comes from.
Yeah, because he sits and not only does he buck authority, but he bucks tradition, as we're going to see, especially with the kung fu styles and all that. And which brings me to this question, which pretty much I'm going to break for Bruce Lee and now talk about you for a minute. Again, you left university, and you write about it in one of your books, and you went to 2 years of studying kung fu at the Shaolin Temple in Henan, China. Why did you do that? And, we have to read your book to see the experience, but how was the experience?
I was this kind of skinny, scrawny, bullied kid when I fell in love with Bruce Lee, and I believed if I studied the martial arts and got good enough at it, I could kind of find the courage to stand up for myself. And that led me to start studying martial arts, but you've probably seen the way most martial artists in America train. They go a couple times a week, and then they skip, and then they go a couple times a week. And so I trained like that. And after a few years, I didn't feel any tougher than I was before. And the opportunity in college to go to the actual Shaolin Temple, which is the birthplace of Kung Fu in mainland China, just seemed too attractive to pass by. But of course, I was also defying my father and running away to China at the time, right after Tiananmen Square, when it was considered a dangerous, dark country, very poor still, was, kind of frightening to everyone. So in a way, this was my grand adventure too.
But the thing is, this training, no one really knows about this type of training. And when I read some of the training that you did, it really says, because you look like an average, ordinary person until you see that photograph of you in New York City doing the flying kick in a taxi cab.
That's right.
It's like, well, you're a year younger than me. You were born in 71. I'm like, so I might be 6'2.5", but then again, Bruce Lee beat the crap out of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, game of death. So it's like, can you imagine what Matthew Polly could do to me? But some of this training was just, what I read, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, 7 hours a day, 60 days a week, running, breathing exercises, calisthenics, kung fu, gymnastics. You became a formidable kickboxer, and you beat a kung fu master from another province in China. But then if you think that's bad enough, then you became an iron forearm expert, where you're supposed to be banging your arm against a tree for 30 minutes a day to build calluses so you can build up a resistance to pain.
Yes, that's exactly what it was like. You summarized it perfectly. The amazing thing about it was it's a little monastery on the top of a mountain in the middle of nowhere, China, and there were 10,000 young Chinese boys, almost exclusively boys. And so there was nothing for us to do but kung fu. There were no TV, no phones, no internet, no Facebook, no Twitter. All we did all day long was study kung fu. And it was 6, 7, 8 hours a day of constant training and doing crazy things like the iron forearm kung fu, because everybody had to have an iron specialty. And the iron head guys all had stutters, so I didn't want to study iron head. So I went with iron forearm, banging my forearm against trees every day. It was pretty nutty, but at that point in my life, it was exactly what I needed.
I don't think anyone ever asked you that question. I'm not even sure, but that's something that a lot of people don't know about when you're doing it.
Yeah, no.
But like I said, I did my homework.
You did. I know you impressed the shit out of me.
It's like, hey, I did my homework. But let me ask you this. So, are you married and have kids?
I do. I'm married and have a young son.
So let me ask you, did both your wife and your son take up, martial arts as well?
So my wife, no, although she will watch it on TV. We watch the UFCs together, and she actually quite enjoys watching the fighting, which is remarkable. Part of the reason I married her. And my son is 3.5. He just started Taekwondo, so he's on his 3rd week of classes.
Now let me ask you, throughout the book, Bruce Lee continues to change his style. He rejects traditionalism. Now, let me ask you this. You studied various forms of martial arts. You were good. Today, if you turn on the TV, there's no more boxing. My kids watch the UFC stuff, the United Fight Channel, in the cages with mixed martial arts. You mentioned that Bruce Lee would be disappointed today, because Kung Fu probably wasn't as popular. But I would argue that it is, and it's coming up. But my question to you is this. Out of all the disciples of study when it comes to martial arts, which do you, I wouldn't ask which is the best, because each one in their own right takes a particular study. Which do you think is the most dominant of all martial arts training?
You mean of traditional martial arts styles? Which one's the most dominant right now?
Yep.
Yeah, so I think, mixed martial arts has become the most dominant through the UFC and through, just the wide media spread it has. And of the styles within mixed martial arts that come from traditional ones, it's Muay Thai, the kickboxing, and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu the ground fighting that originally comes from Japan. Those two have kind of spread like wildfire in the States, and so those are the two traditional styles that have done the best because of the influence of mixed martial arts and its tremendous popularity.
If you were to do it all over again today, knowing the different disciples you studied under and, of course, the different traditional martial arts, which one would you throw your whole heart and soul into?
I really think Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is a beautiful art. And it has some great advantages, which is you can continue practicing it later in life because you don't get punched in the face. So I think that one's a really beautiful art form. But I think I would still throw in a style of kung fu here or there because there's an aspect of learning forms that's highly meditative. And I think people forget that the martial arts isn't only about self-defense. It's also about spiritual practice. And that's one of the things that I think the mixed martial arts cage fighting guys have forgotten.
Yeah, right, because to them, there's just a will to kill. But when you look at the old training, like with Chuck Norris, you could see they battle for each other. I don't know. You probably saw it. Revenge of the Ninja, 1983. That was a...
Yeah. It's been a while, but yes, I did see that once upon a time.
That's one of my favorites. And I was about 13 at the time, just like when Bruce took up Wing Chun, and we'll get to him when he goes to Yip Man. But I remember it has one of the greatest scenes in Los Angeles when they're fighting on the roof, and the iron-faced ninja against it. But there is Japanese traditions in there, and they both utilize it through the film. I didn't understand it then. I have a little bit more, but both of them, even though the evil ninja and the good ninja, they still sat down and kneeled down, and they did their little ritual before they were to fight each other in respect for one another.
Yes, I think that's an important part of the Eastern tradition. It's not always practiced, but it's something that's emphasized by teachers, and I do fear that the influence of sort of our entertainment culture has turned mixed martial arts a little too much into guys who, take trash cans and throw them at buses and trash talk each other as much as they can. And so it becomes more like pro wrestling and less like its roots and the respect and tradition that's associated with the Eastern martial arts.
Now, at 13, Bruce went to Yip Man. And what was it like training under Yip Man?
Yeah, so he started with Ip Man at about 16, and the reason why, and this is what I found fascinating, was it wasn't so he could defend himself against bullies, it was so he could be a better street fighter. What his favorite activity, because he got into so much trouble in school and he was so hyperactive, was to go out in the streets with his little gang of friends, which he was the leader of, and start fights. And one day he met a boy who was a year older and bigger and who was also better as a fighter. And this drove Bruce crazy because he was so competitive. And he tried to figure out how this boy was better, and it turned out the boy studied Wing Chun Kung Fu. And so Bruce only took up Wing Chun to try to be the best street fighter that he could be. And that's how he started with Ip Man in Wing Chun. And their training every day was basically all the boys trying to be the best fighter that they could be.
Now, also in Hong Kong, and a lot of people, fail to understand. Again, this is post-World War II, and post, communist China gets taken over in 1949, and post the Korean War. And here we have Bruce Lee in Hong Kong. The British have been there since 1844 to 1846. I think the Opium War was there. And there was this disdain amongst the Hong Kong population that they should be able to self-govern. And this whole anti-British thing was coming out in the 1950s. And that influenced Bruce, that he would pretty much pick only on white kids. Explain that.
Yeah. Well, the important thing to understand is Bruce was ecumenical. He would fight everybody, but they really liked what they called it limey bashing. and every Hong Kong Chinese was resentful of the fact that the British ruled the island. This far-flung race from across the seas had come over and seized this island so they could sell opium, sell drugs, essentially. I've often thought, like, if the Cali cartel had seized Miami just so it could sell cocaine to America and had total control over it, how we would feel. But anyway, so he would go out and they would go over to the all-British boys' school and start fights. And it was this kind of interesting, it was like West Side Story. They would just go back and fights back and forth. And then, of course, they'd try to date British girls, and the British boys would try to date Chinese girls, and then they'd fight over that. So it was very sort of 1950s New York City feel to it, with gangsters and little kids running around getting into fights.
Now, just when you think that a guy, well, a kid, like Bruce Lee is all about fighting and all about this rage, the guy's into cha-cha, for God's sakes. He keeps a the guy keeps a notebook and becomes a master, and he actually gave cha-cha lessons.
Yeah, he's such a great character. This is why I love nonfiction, because you just couldn't make this up. He was into the latest trends. So in Hong Kong, it was a pretty westernized colony, and they got all the radio stations because they had American and British troops stationed there. And so they would listen to kind of Buddy Holly, and Elvis Presley was huge. Bruce went through a big Elvis phase. But he did all the dance moves, the boogie woogie, the Lindy Hop. But his favorite was cha-cha. And he became the cha-cha champion of Hong Kong. And he was completely obsessed with it. And, you know, as I was doing the research, I often wondered if Bruce had come to America and they would pay him to become a dance teacher, if he would have ended up the Fred Astaire of cha-cha instead of the king of kung fu like he did, because he really did love dancing almost as much as martial arts, and he was able to combine those two on screen, which is why I think he's so graceful when you see him on screen.
And you know what's interesting also about Bruce here is that another thing I learned. You know, people ask me, well, you have all these authors on the show, and you've studied history. How much do you really learn? Well, with your book, I've learned a hell of a lot, and one of them is Bruce Lee had an acting career as a child.
Yes, no one knows this. When I was growing up and I was a Bruce Lee fan, I sort of thought he was just this kung fu master, this guru, who randomly made a couple movies at the end of his life. But it turns out he was making movies from the time he was 3 months old. When he was in San Francisco, he appeared playing a little girl, which was his first and only cross-dressing role. But by the time he was 6, he had a full-flung movie career. He was kind of the Macaulay Culkin of Hong Kong. He played orphans and weepies and melodramas, excuse me, and not one of the 20 movies he made as a child actor involved kung fu at all. So part of the reason he was so successful later in life is that he was a for-real actor from a very early age, and he brought those skills to action movies.
Now, this is something that totally blew my mind. When you think about my last name, Kahanowitz, well, yeah, you know, he's Jewish. So's Bruce Lee. So's Bruce Lee. He's Jewish. Well, quarter Jew. He comes from Dutch Jewish ancestry.
That's right. That blew me away as well. My wife's Jewish, and so there was one day when I discovered this. No one had ever found this out before, and I was doing some deep research, and I ran downstairs, and I was like, honey, I think Bruce Lee's Jewish too. So it was an incredible sort of realization of how much more there was to know about the man. And I think it's interesting because most people just think of him as pure Chinese, but the fact was he was Eurasian. He was part Jewish. He was also part English and Chinese. And that meant that he didn't really fit in either community in colonial Hong Kong. He wasn't pure European. He wasn't pure Chinese. And so he was always trying to figure out a way to bridge the gap between those two cultures.
And this is one way he bridged the gap, which I had no idea, because like you mentioned in your book, when we see Bruce Lee or we hear about Bruce Lee, because he died so young, he was pretty much martyred. So he's this great hero, and we don't look at him as a flawed character. But your book, instead of going into the reading of it and say, well, I wonder if the author's going to, just advocate, because you read so many things and they just advocate for the
right.
You didn't, and you exposed the flaws. And here's how he bridged the gap. He had affairs on his wife, Linda. And it's both acceptable in Chinese, and at the time in the 1960s, during the free love era, his grandfather had 13 concubines. Now, if I had 13 concubines, I would have taken myself and thrown myself out a window, because I would not deal with that, okay? What's going on with Bruce Lee and bridging the gap by cheating on his wife here?
Yes. So the first thing I wanted to do in writing the book is I felt too many of them were hagiographies. They were just like Bruce Lee's amazing, rah, rah, rah. And, that's fine if you're a child, but we're all adults now. We know we all have flaws, even our heroes do. And so I wanted to sort of see who he was in the full warts and all view. And he grew up in a culture that was polygamous. As you mentioned, his father had 13 concubines. I find it hard enough to make one woman happy. I don't know what he was doing with 13. But I guess he just didn't care if they were happy or not. And then, of course, he went over to Hollywood in the 60s, and Steve McQueen was his role model and his friend and mentor. So for him, Bruce Lee, his view was it was like kind of Mad Men 1950s vision where, if you're a husband, you do whatever you want on the side and then you're discreet about it. And so he had a few affairs, probably more than a few, but I was able to track down a few of them, with co-stars, on the movies he was in and TV shows. And, these beautiful statuesque blondes. So that was sort of his type.
Now, another thing, I don't know if we celebrated or we remembered the Manson murders in the 1960s, 69, I think in August. Now, Lee was friends with Sharon Tate. Did they have an off-screen romance as well?
No, I don't think so. I think those two were actually just friends. There's been some speculation about that one, but as far as I can tell, they were just friendly.
Now, they found a pair of glasses at the murder scene. And I think Roman Polanski, who was friends with Lee, got scared, saying, "Oh my God, this could be Bruce Lee's, glasses. He might have been the one to do this." How did Roman Polanski find out that Bruce wasn't the murderer?
Yeah, that's one of the crazy stories. Bruce was friends with Sharon Tate, and he was Roman Polanski's martial arts instructor. And at the scene of the crime of the Manson murders, the murderers left behind a pair of horn-rimmed glasses. And one day when Bruce was training Polanski afterwards, he said quite casually, "I lost my glasses." And for a few brief moments, Polanski was an absolute terror. And so he said, "Why don't, after class, we'll go by the store and get you new glasses." And he thought if the prescription matched, then he would have caught the murderer. But it turned out the prescription was completely different, and Polanski breathed a huge sigh of relief that Bruce Lee was not the killer of during the Manson murders, and they finally caught the real ones. But he never told Bruce Lee the story. He only wrote about it in his autobiography years later, and so that's when everybody found out about it.
Now, another interesting story is this. And when I read it, I had to take notes because because I've studied, basically my thesis paper back in college 26 years ago was on how China survives the Japanese invasion from 1931 to 1945. But in it, I got a deep affection for the character of Charlie Chan. Now, all the paradoxes here come out with Charlie Chan, and I'll tell you why. In the 1920s and 30s, American immigration limited Asian, immigrants. Mm-hmm. They didn't want Asians in. Even before in San Francisco, they literally segregated the Japanese and the Chinese into separate quarters. So they were gerrymandering. So the voting districts or whatever, they were put in a different. It's basically segregation. 1940s. The Japanese internment camp. Again, anti-Asian. But now through this all here, Charlie Chan, the detective, was the most highly touted and made 48 movies from 1931 to 1949, more than Sherlock Holmes from 1939 to 1945 with Basil Rathbone. In addition, you had the Mr. Wong series with Boris Karloff, and I think Key Luke, who played number one son in a lot of these Charlie Chan films, I think he took over as Mr. Wong. And, of course, you had Peter Lorre, who played Mr. Moto. Now, what's striking here is everyone who played Mr. Moto, Charlie Chan, and Mr. Wong, they were all white. There was no Asians playing a lead character role. Bruce Lee tried to change this, and how did he try to change it?
Well, first I have to say, you're the only interviewer I've ever had who knows more about Charlie Chan than I do. So that's congrats to you.
I wrote a whole book about Charlie Chan. It's just not published, and I'm publishing 2 other sport books, but I got to get it out. I've done extensive research on it.
It's amazing. You definitely got to try. I knew there had to be something. So yeah, exactly right. Charlie Chan was this incredibly popular character. We don't realize this now because he's fallen off. But at the time there were, as you said, dozens and dozens of Charlie Chan movies, all played by white actors. Bruce's first break was supposed to be playing in a TV series as the lead as Charlie Chan's number one son. That was what was offered to him, and he thought he was going to walk into Hollywood and start off as the star of his own TV show, which would have represented the first time a Chinese male actor had ever starred in a TV series. And so he was all gung-ho. He thought he was, at bat, he was going to be the Jackie Robinson of Asian actors. And then, as we know, with the racist Hollywood, it got pulled out from underneath him. And instead he ended up having to play Kato, the houseboy and chauffeur, in The Green Hornet. And the only reason he agreed is because the producers promised that he would be able to show off his kung fu and be really the weapon of the Green Hornet. And that's why he ended up accepting that role.
2 things that you mentioned. First of all, if he would have landed the role of being, number one son and having his own show, that would have been a breakthrough because that would have been the first, Chinese lead character actor in one of these things, because a lot of people don't know that J. Carrol Nash played Charlie Chan on the TV series in the late 50s when they revised it about 8 years after. About 8 years after Sky Dragon was released, and the movies ended in 1949 because of the whole communist taking over in China, then, forbid everything Chinese. And so, the Charlie Chan legacy died with Roland Winters. And now here's a different tidbit. Key Luke, again, came back as number one son in the last 4 episodes of the Charlie Chan movies, and he was older than Roland Winters by 4 years, who played his father. And if you don't think Chinese are being discriminated there, I don't know what is. But you made Kato. And I've watched The Green Hornet. I'm old enough, like you are, to see The Green Hornet, the Batman episode, which we'll go into. Where he scared the hell out of Burt Ward. But this is what I wanted to say. Kato was supposed to be a sidekick. And like you mentioned, he wasn't going to play a sidekick. He was going to play a serious character, and he was going to excel at Kato and show the world martial arts, which he did. But this is what struck me when I read your book. He did his normal kung fu. They told him to slow down, and again, he was defiant. He said, "You're changing the way I'm doing things." But when they showed him the replays, what went on there?
Yeah, so he was on set. He'd never done kung fu on film before. All of his performances had been live because remember when he was a child actor, he never was in kung fu movies. So he knew how to do kung fu. He was already a master at it, but he didn't know how to do it on film. And so he was going in and dealing with these old, white stuntmen who were used to that kind of long, looping John Wayne punch. And he was trying to throw these 12 kicks and punches in 3 seconds. And it frustrated the stuntmen, but even worse, it couldn't be picked up on camera. And he didn't realize this, so finally they showed him some rushes of daily rushes of what had been filmed, and you couldn't see anything. It was all black and just a blur. and he was distraught. But Van Williams, who played the Green Hornet, kind of took him aside and had a little chat with him. And Bruce, and this is one of the great reasons he succeeded in life, is when he saw something wasn't working, he was very pragmatic and willing to change. And so even though he was defiant at first, he realized he had made a mistake. And so he slowed it down, and he became actually more popular than the Green Hornet. He received more fan mail. The kids loved him. And so he was the star of the show, even though he was playing the houseboy.
Now, Bruce Ward, was it Bruce or Burt Ward? Burt Ward, who played Robin. Yeah. They were going to have that silly episode. You know, something I really liked it. He was making fun of Bruce Lee or something behind his back, and Bruce Lee, he started playing around with Burt Ward. What was going on there?
Yeah. So initially, the Green Hornet they were trying to save the Green Hornet. The Batman, the TV series, was a huge success, and the Green Hornet was a kind of failing. So they were going to do a crossover episode, and they were going to have a mutual fight scene between the two, and the Green Hornet and Kato were supposed to lose to Batman and Robin, and Bruce refused. He was like, there's no way I can lose to Robin. No one would believe that. I'm, this killer kung fu guy. But what had annoyed him is that Burt Ward was being asked questions like, are you a kung fu master? And he would say, yes, I'm a black belt, when of course he wasn't. So Bruce decided right before the set to, teach Burt Ward a lesson. And he told everyone he was going to really show him what a black belt was really like. And Burt Ward became terrified during the scene that Bruce would actually hurt him. And so Bruce basically backed him into a corner, and Burt Ward was flopping around, begging, please don't hurt me, until finally Bruce started laughing because it was just a practical joke. So that's how he taught Burt Ward a lesson about respect and honor.
It's interesting because, again, when I read your book, what people don't understand is when Bruce Lee made it big in the films, it was pretty much from, I say, 71 to his death at 73, and a few of the films were released posthumously. Now, what people don't understand and they don't get is that throughout the years, Bruce Lee was setting up schools for kung fu and martial arts. Let's talk a little bit about what he taught and why he rejected other forms of schools. And there was a challenge in Oakland. We'll talk about that.
Yeah. So when Bruce Lee first came to America, he looked at the kind of acting roles that were given to Asian actors, what he called kind of hop-along-wong roles, basically houseboys, and what he called pigtail coolies. And he decided there's no way for him to make a career as an actor. So what he decided to do was become sort of the Ray Kroc of Kung Fu. He would franchise Kung Fu schools across the country. And so while he was in college and then afterwards, he ended up opening 3 schools, one in Seattle, Oakland, and Los Angeles. But unlike other Chinese teachers who only wanted to teach Chinese students, Bruce was incredibly open, probably from his Eurasian heritage. And he took in students from every different ethnic group. And from them, he started to pick up some of the things that they were good at. And he also realized that some of the moves he had been taught wouldn't work against a 6'3", 250-pound, big white guy. So he started to modify what he was doing and ended up creating a style that he called Jeet Kune Do.
And what did Jeet Kune Do entail?
So Jeet Kune Do was a mixture of boxing, the footwork and punching of boxing, the kicking of Kung Fu, and also fencing. Bruce's older brother Peter was a fencing master a fencing expert as a young teenager, and Bruce picked up fencing from his brother, and so he thought of Jeet Kune Do as kind of unarmed fencing, using the lead hand and jabbing fingers. And the reason he, as you mentioned in your question, the reason why he decided his style of Wing Chun wasn't good enough is because he had gotten into a challenge fight with a master of another style, Northern Shaolin style, in Oakland in 1964. And so Bruce, he fought him, he won, but it was an ugly win. It didn't go well, it took a long time, and Bruce was really frustrated, and so he decided to change up his style of martial arts.
And this is where he rejects tradition, and it just goes back to the gold dragon, which he was born under. He's always trying to buck tradition and smooth the future, just like the meanings were. And this is how he smoothed the future. He kept making adjustments. He kept improvising regarding his kung fu styles, and this continued well into making movies. By the time he did make movies, and, you know, all the choreography or whatever, was he still using kung fu?
You know, what's interesting is if you watch Bruce Lee's movies, when I was a kid, I thought of it as kung fu because Bruce Lee was the king of kung fu. But what's on screen isn't like any kung fu that actually existed in China at that time. He had combined so many different things that Bruce Lee was really doing Bruce Lee. And you can see when you watch his co-stars next to him try to do stuff, that they're fighting in that kind of Chinese opera kung fu, very pantomime, large movements. Or if you watch a Jet Li movie, you can see sort of what kung fu looks like in a kind of operatic form. But Bruce Lee had combined like taekwondo kicks with karate punches, with his own invention of things. He was also throwing in kind of judo throws and holds. And so Bruce Lee's style on screen is purely Bruce Lee.
Now, let me ask you this. When he came to America, he went to Seattle, and he worked in a restaurant. The family friend, Ruby Chow, promised Bruce a job. He hated the job. He couldn't stand the job. Now, in typical Bruce Lee fashion, you would think he would just walk away and say, hey, the hell with this. I'm not going to do it. Why did he stick it out?
He didn't have a choice. So that's one of the things that's amazing about his story, and I think every family can relate to, is Bruce Lee was the black sheep of the family. He kept getting into trouble, and finally the police came because he got into so many fights and told his parents if he didn't stop, they were going to throw him in jail. And so they sent him to America to essentially scare him straight. And the way they did that was they got him a job in a Chinese restaurant. He had to live in a walk-in closet underneath a staircase. That was his room. It was like basically a cell. In fact, prison cells were bigger than the room he had to stay in. And he didn't have any money, and he got ordered around to do the dirtiest jobs in the restaurant. And the thing was, Bruce Lee had grown up pretty affluent. His only job as a kid was being a movie actor. So he wasn't used to being treated like this. And he hated it, but he wanted to prove to his father that he wouldn't quit. And he also really didn't have any money and nowhere else to go. So this is why he ended up staying in this job that he hated. He hated Ruby Chow. She hated him back. She thought he was an arrogant, no good, disrespectful boy. But between the two of them fighting, he actually found some ambition and some drive and some focus in his life.
Which goes to the fact that he opened a school, and this is where he met his wife, Linda, who you had the honor of interviewing. And how did this occur, and how was Linda when you interviewed her?
Yes, I had the great honor to interview his widow, Linda Lee. She's a really remarkable woman. She's gone through two unbelievable tragedies. She lost her husband at an early age, and of course she lost her son, Brandon, when he was very young, at the age of 28. And I have the most admiration and respect for her as a human being. And she's very kind of humble and sweet and kind to talk to. What I was amazed by was just how much she loves Bruce Lee to this day. You would think after 45 years, maybe some of that would wane, but if anything, I think he's grown, for her. And so she told me some of the stories about how basically she saw him first, and I think instantly was gaga for him. And she had no interest in the martial arts, but she heard he was teaching martial arts, and so she signed up for the class just to be near him. And eventually, after a couple of years of being one of his disciples and following him around, he asked her out on a date, and they started dating. But this is a thing that no one remembers nowadays. Back then, interracial marriages were illegal in 17 states, and it was sort of the gay marriage of that era. And so she kept it secret because she knew she was Caucasian. Her mother would not approve of her dating a Chinese guy. And so they almost eloped to try to get away from her mother, but they found out about it and her parents tried to stop the marriage. And so Bruce Lee faced some tremendous discrimination. Like, his own in-laws didn't want him to be married to his wife.
Not only that, but I think when Linda's parents found out she got pregnant, they almost, oh my God, what that poor woman had to go through.
Yeah, that's the thing. And so this is one of the, when you're doing this research, you discover these things and you're like, why did no one else figure this out? No one else had ever reported why Bruce Lee dropped out of school to get married, and I was trying to figure out, and then, quite obviously I did the math, and Brandon, the first child, was born 5.5 months after the wedding. But what happened in the fight was they couldn't understand why they were rushing off to get married, and finally the secret came out that she was pregnant, and so they were getting married so the kid would be legitimate. And the parents even then said, we still don't want you to marry him, that they would rather she raise a child without a father around than marry a Chinese guy. That was the kind of level of racial animus that existed at that time.
Let me ask you this question: the only way she found out that Bruce, was not faithful to her was, we'll get to this in a minute because this is the number one question everyone always asks you. I save it for the last because I just wanted to get people to know who Bruce Lee was rather than highlighting his death. I'm going to save it for the end. We haven't even got to the movies. Like I said, we're not going to finish everything. We're going to get you back again. But this is the thing: was she bitter when she found out that Bruce died in his mistress's apartment, literally, and all the stories of infidelity had surfaced after he passed on?
When I interviewed her, she was still not fully convinced that the woman in whose bed Bruce Lee died was Bruce's mistress. She said, I don't think he would, she still didn't believe he would do it, and I don't think anyone's ever told her about the other ones. And so, I think it's one of those things where someone dies and you're through tremendous grief and you form an image of who they were and you stick with that. And you don't want that to change. And so, despite the sort of pretty obviousness of it, I don't think she just put that in the back of her mind and didn't think about it.
Yeah, it's almost like a regressive nature. So, she's repressing all those bad things and just focusing on the fact of what just happened. Bruce had died. Now, you know what's interesting? Yep. This is another interesting thing before I get into his death for the last segment of the show. With all his fame, with what he did for Kung Fu and for martial arts films, and the ceremony he had both in China and America with all these great actors and actresses coming, and, Chuck Norris, who you interviewed, still pissed off 45 years after the fact that he, that Bruce Lee was able to, we'll get to that next time anyway, but that was a great story. But you figured there would be statues about Bruce Lee. There's only one statue in Serbia. Why Serbia?
Yes. So that's amazing. The first statue of Bruce Lee to ever go up in the world is in Mostar in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And it got put up because they had, during the Yugoslav Civil War, which people have forgotten about in the early 90s, the Catholic Croats and the Muslim Serbs and the two sides of town were at each other's throats, and there was killings, and after the war ended, they still hated each other, and they wanted to put up some symbol of peace and solidarity. And it turned out that the town voted on it, and the candidates were the Pope, Gandhi, and Bruce Lee, and Bruce Lee won as a symbol of racial solidarity and harmony. And his movie Enter the Dragon had been a huge deal in Eastern Europe in the 80s, and everybody who was Serb, who was either Muslim or Catholic, had all loved Bruce Lee movies, and it was the one thing they had in common, and that's why they put up a Bruce Lee statue to symbolize peace and racial justice.
It's amazing, that of all places that they did it, and the reasons why he gave it. Now we get to the death part, and this has been talked about, it's been theorized, it's been gossiped. I mean, you even mentioned some of it in your book. The paper sensationalized it. Whatever it may be, you argue that it's heat stroke and that he did not, and although the coroner said, I think the coroner that examined him, he died from aspirin. Now, I can't pronounce his name. Equagesic? Is that how you say it?
Yeah, it's a pain medication, Equagesic, that has aspirin in it. Yeah.
You give instances in the book. Look, it's early May. Bruce Lee is not feeling well, so we see that there are signals that something's going on. Now, my question is, I understand why Bruce Lee pulled out his gland so that he wouldn't be sweaty on screen, but didn't the doctor that did this, knowing what he does and knowing his sensitivity to heat, which you mentioned in the book, would affect him in any way?
Yeah, it's amazing. So for 45 years, there's been this great mystery about why Bruce Lee died. And there's been hundreds of theories about it. And I literally spent 2 years talking to forensic pathologists, neurobiologists, trying to get some sort of idea. And finally, the clue that broke it open for me was 4 or 5 months before he dies, Bruce Lee has an operation to remove the sweat glands under his armpits. And he did that because he was sweating on screen and they had to wipe him down after every shot, and it got really frustrating. And so they offered to do this, and I have no idea why they would do something to someone who had a history of being vulnerable to heat, but they did, probably because he was a huge star, and they just did whatever he wanted. But that, I think, is what killed him, because the day he died was the hottest day of the summer. He was actively performing kung fu moves in this very tiny apartment, and after he was done, Raymond Chow, who was his boss, told me in my exclusive interview with him that Bruce Lee was feeling tired and dizzy and a bit faint and complained of a headache, which are all signs of heat stroke or overheating.
But even with that, there's even a more important inquiry, because you, even with that, when you mention that, I'm like, there has to be a distinguished explanation, and you do it in your book. The same thing can be said about, aspirin. Some of the symptoms, swelling on the brain and all this other stuff. But you make it clear in the book what distinguished the coroner's, depiction of how Lee died and what you're saying here. And let's talk about the distinction here.
Well, aspirin allergy is anaphylactic shock. And it's what you see with bee stings or someone who has a peanut allergy, and it causes redness and swelling. And if you eat an aspirin and you're hyper allergic to it, your tongue swells, your throat swells, and it closes up, and you asphyxiate, and the asphyxia causes the brain to swell, and that's why they see it in an autopsy. In Bruce's autopsy, the only thing they saw that was wrong was that he had swelling of the brain. And so the problem was he didn't have any of those other signs. He didn't have red or itching or swollen throat, neck, or mouth. So he couldn't have had an aspirin allergy. They were basically just shooting in the dark because they had no idea what caused it, and they missed sort of the obvious one in front of them. And it's amazing everyone else missed it too, which is, heat stroke kills a lot of young athletic men. If you work out and you get dehydrated, it doesn't matter how tough you are, you go down. And it's killed NFL pro football players, it kills high school football players, lacrosse players, soldiers in the field in Iraq, and Hong Kong's a tropical island. It gets really hot. And so I think that's what got him.
Now let me ask you this question. It'll be my final question. The thing is, he took recreational drugs, Lee.
Yep.
And he took the aspirin, which was discontinued in the United States. This brand of aspirin after a while because of the side effects. In your opinion, is it possible that the mixture of the recreational drugs they found him in that day, combined with the aspirin, could have contributed to the heat stroke as well?
That's a great question. So to be specific about recreational, he liked cannabis. He didn't do any other type of drugs that we know of. He smoked pot, and he liked kind of hash brownies. And sometimes when he didn't have brownies, he would just chew on the hash itself. And that's what he did that last day when he went over to Betty Ting-Pei's apartment. She was his mistress. They kind of hung out and did what the mistresses and her boyfriends do. But they also had a little hash. And then later in the day, he was performing kung fu scenes. So that could have made him more dehydrated. And I talked to some experts at NYU and UCLA, and they said hash in and of itself doesn't kill anyone. You can't die from hash, and certainly you don't get cerebral edema, but it could have helped in the process of dehydrating. And that's, all the things that lead to heat stroke, the most important is your water intake. And if you're taking something that kind of sucks up the water, then that can make it worse.
Well, let me tell you something, Matt. This was a great show. It's an unbelievable experience for me to interview you and to find out so much about someone that I've known all my life, at least through magazines and stuff, but to bring such, facts, in light of who Bruce Lee was, an amazing story. I hope you had a good time today.
I had the best time, Ian. Thanks so much for having me on, and I hope we can do it again.
Yeah, we're going to do it before, like I mentioned, before the holidays. Hold on for about a minute. I'm going to end my show, and then I'll talk to you after I end the show for about a minute. You get to critique me like I do every guest. I do. I always want to know what I'm doing right, what I'm doing wrong. My fans know this. But, folks, we had a great time with Matthew Polly. Go out, get Bruce Lee. We're going to have him back next time. We'll talk about some of the films and his later life. Later, he died at 32. But we'll talk about the 70s and how he really didn't make much money for a while, and his rise to stardom and on his unfortunate death, which we talked about how he died. But then we're going to see the aftershocks that were felt throughout the world. As always, I'm Ian Kahanowitz. Thank you, Matthew Polly, for being on the show. And we are out from the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, and of course, our fearless leader, the Zigzag Man. And as I end every show, in the immortal words of Edward R. Murrow, good night, folks, and good luck.
This has been a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.